Hello, I'm Dr. Scott McLaughlin of the School of Music, and I will be talking you through today the idea of practice research, artistic research, and the many other names under which this is known, and some ideas of how you can apply this in this module to take your own practice of filmmaking into your research projects. So first off, my own positionality in this. I'm a composer. I make an art music, avant-garde, experimental, drone music. You can see more about this on my website, which is there. It's important, I think, to understand that I come at this not as a trained researcher in the tradition of musicology, that is, the tradition of historical or analytical approaches to looking at music, or even sociological or psychological. I come at this as a practitioner. I was a composer before I went into academia. I did a PhD, and I entered the academy about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, as a lecturer. So I come at this as a composer who views his own music and compositional process as being a form of research, and how I can frame that as research and make it useful for other people. So practice research, artistic research. Before I begin, I just want to talk a little bit through this poem that was presented as part of Natalie Lovelace's article, Practice in the Flesh of Theory, Art, Research and the Fine Arts. And my screen image here is probably cutting off some of these citations, but I'll upload these slides as well so you can look at the full citations if you need to. So the poem she takes from Gallup goes like this. Abstract disembodied theory, theory in no place or time, dreams of being the last word. In contrast, occasional anecdotal theory, theory in the flesh of practice, speaks with the desire for a response. In some ways, this is a bit of an oversimplification, the idea that theory, which is disembodied and dry and dusty, dreams of being the last word, always wants to be able to say, this is a truth. We have a theory, and this is the truth, and this will stay the truth for all time. Whereas there's another type of research, this anecdotal theory, theory in the flesh of practice, speaks with the desire for a response, that this is somehow more in the now, it's in the present, and it's coming through a practice. It's not research about a thing, it's research through a thing, theory in the flesh. It's a bit of a false dichotomy, but at the same time there is a ring of truth as an artistic practitioner myself, as an artistic practitioner doing theory, that is, doing theory through the practice, and speaking with a desire for a response, doing practice in a way that brings this intrinsic theory out and that presents it in a way that opens it up to discussion from other artists, other theorists, other researchers. Lovelace, by the way, this also has an excellent book, which I'll refer back to a little bit later, that's well worth looking at. So, practice research is the umbrella term that I'm using here, but this goes under many, many other names, and this is partly because practice research is quite a new thing. So you may come across some or all of these terms as you start to look into this area, if you haven't already. To break this down a little bit, within the UK, we currently tend to say either practice as research or just practice research. But historically, over the last 10 to 20 years, there's been a lot of variance around ideas of practice-led research, practice-based research, and several other variants around that. And there's been quite a lot of long discussions trying to get at the fine nuances between these things, which, frankly, aren't really worth arguing about. It's certainly at this point when you're just getting used to the idea. Outside of the UK, in Europe, particularly around the Netherlands and Scandinavia, the idea of artistic research is more prevalent, the artist as researcher, although essentially the same principles will apply, as you'll see, but that phrase is more often used. We also have the phrase research creation, which will come up a couple of times here and comes largely out of Canada. practice as research, I should say. Practice research is UK, also Australia also uses this phrase a lot. Embodied research is another way of thinking about a similar thing, although this is coming less out of a geographical description, more out of a disciplinary one. Embodied research comes out of theatre and movement, so research that is through and from the body. But what you'll see is that all of these come down to a central idea that artistic practitioners carrying out an artistic practice are creating research, and that this research is valued in the academy. So first off, what is practice? I've written here practice as noun, not verb. Actually, I think that might even be backwards, that both of these things can apply. But when we talk about practice, we are talking sometimes about the practice of an artist, the thing that they do. But when we're trying to talk about it as research, what we often really want to talk about it is actually the verb, the practicing, the doing of a practice, whatever that practice is, be it a composer, be it a filmmaker, a sculptor, a painter, a photographer, an architect. There are all sorts of artistic practices, some of which, like architecture for example, sit on the boundaries of what would be considered art and other more functional forms, etc. So artistic practice encompasses everything from the ideation, the coming up of an idea, a concept, carrying through with the making, the doing of that thing, whatever that might involve, all the way through to the product. And this distinction between process and product is going to come back a few times in what we're talking about today. Artistic research practice also involves, to varying levels and in varying ways, ideas of craft and skill, how a thing is done and done well, and that usually fits within certain constraints. How we would consider, say, a well-crafted chair is one that might look nice, it might not look nice, but you should be able to sit on it. If it's not a well-crafted chair, you probably won't be able to sit on it because it breaks or because it's been designed badly. Craft and skill. Discipline, the taking of an idea and pushing it through, the rigor of that idea. Creativity, which can sometimes be in opposition to craft. Creativity, the exploration of new ideas, new approaches to things, taking things from a completely different perspective, which might involve, if we go back to my chair analogy again, taking something like a chair which is incredibly creative, so creative to the point that you can't sit on it because its chairness has now been subservient to something else. Maybe it's a chair made entirely out of paper, or a chair made entirely out of pins, or something unsittable, but still a chair. Also, practice can include things like accidents, the materiality of something, its physical presence in space, concepts. Often artistic things may not be concerned with either the physical reality of a thing, or its performance, or its craftedness, or its skill at all. Often art is simply a concept materialized in some way or put into ideation in some way that it can be communicated. So all of these things can be part of an artistic practice. As a side note, if you are researching this, beware of particularly the area of medicine and healthcare also use the term practice research, but they use it to refer to ideas of a doctor's practice or nursing practice. In some ways it's similar and it overlaps. It is about the lived experience of these people carrying out these practices. But at the same time, it's also quite different because it's adopting a social science methodology, as we'll see a little bit more of in a few minutes. To go on to the idea then of how practice research sits within the academy, we partly have to think about how it relates to research, which we'll come on to in a moment. But just to set that up, this is from Henk Borgdorf's The Conflict of the Faculties. Borgdorf is a very big name in the area of artistic research and has written a lot of the key theory around particularly the Dutch and European approaches to artistic research. So Borgdorf says the issue of the intrinsic nature of research in the arts can indeed best be addressed by also asking how that type of research differs from what we normally understand by scholarly or scientific research. That does not mean we ought to conform in advance to the frameworks defined by traditional scholarship or science, but it also does not mean we should counterpose something to that definition, to that form of scholarship that eludes those frameworks by definition. So, two ideas that are going to be important come out of this. One is that when the Academy thinks about scholarly research, the word research in the Academy essentially comes from a science background, the science approach to objective and empirical making of knowledge. And we'll look at this in the next few slides about research, but also the idea that artistic research or practice research, because it's coming in new to this area, simultaneously shouldn't try to pretend to be science, because it's not. It shouldn't conform in advance to those frameworks. It has to reform research in a way that works for artists and the artistic stakeholders. Equally, there is no point in artistic research coming in and attempting to completely upend the ideas of research in such a way that there's no way for practice research to fit alongside science. So it has to find a balance point between the possibilities for being a completely different approach and being something that's simply mimicking science. So what is research? In order to answer this, I'm going to start with the definition given by the UK REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which is an audit exercise carried out across universities in the UK every 4 to 5 years. For the REF, research is defined as a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. Now, this definition usefully covers just about anything we could consider to be research within academia, certainly in the UK and pretty much worldwide. If we break that down, there are essentially 4 key discipline areas that we think about when we're talking about research. One is STEM, which stands for Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths. And this, as I said before, is the key model for thinking about research. Scientific research coming out of the Enlightenment and the rational approach to education is essentially the key stone, but other disciplines have reshaped that to fit their needs. There is also, and I'll just point this out for the sake of it, a new idea, but one that's gaining traction, is the idea of STEAM, which is STEM plus arts, particularly as both scientists and artists and politicians and people outside that and policymakers begin to understand the possibilities for art as something that can enliven and relate and assist with STEM research, that these two things shouldn't be pulled apart. So, as well as STEM in terms of research is essentially, and this is greatly simplifying everything, but for the sake just here of thinking of these 4 different ways of approaching research, you'll allow me the simplification for the moment. The STEM approach is objective knowledge. It's about measuring phenomena to an extent that allows us to reliably report results that other people can then take the same experiments and methodologies, produce ideally the same results, and the more people that do that, the more researchers that can repeat an experiment and reliably produce the same results, we can say, well, this is knowledge that we can trust. This is objective knowledge. And science is pretty much entirely built on this approach. 99.9% of science is measuring something, which means also carefully taking the thing you want to measure, removing contingencies, removing dirt and messiness from the thing, getting controlled laboratory conditions so that you can say for absolute certainty that this thing, we measured it, it is now reliable knowledge. You can imagine also that within the sciences this is not always easy, whereas it might be relatively easy to take a certain set of chemicals, put them in a clinical controlled environment, make them interact at fixed temperatures, and measure exactly the results of this interaction and what new chemicals are formed. That's reasonably doable. Once you try and put that into biology, things get much more difficult, as you're now dealing with the messiness of cells and life, and removing potential dirt and contaminants and things that might get in the way of your measurements becomes more difficult, etc. But the principle still applies. Objective knowledge within science is largely generated through controlled experiment and measurement. The social sciences largely attempts to take this model and apply it to people. People, of course, are much more difficult to measure than chemicals or even plants. So within the social sciences, a set of methodologies emerge that largely come about from statistical inferences. Again, you have attempts to make controlled experiments, but this might involve doing them across entire populations of people. The principle is still that there is objective knowledge, but this comes with the knowledge also that the quantitative approach of counting things needs to be balanced with what is called a qualitative approach. So the quantitative and the qualitative tend to go hand in hand. Some social scientists prefer the quantitative, some prefer the qualitative. Many of them use mixed methods, and qualitative things include approaches more like interviews. So it becomes more interpretive. It becomes more about talking to people, asking questions, and assessing the answers, and trying to make some sort of measurements sometimes, or some sort of conclusions based from these. This takes us into the third large discipline area, which is the humanities. In many ways, the humanities is probably older than, well, it's definitely older than the social sciences, probably also older than science in many ways. The humanities goes right back to the Greeks and before that. But the humanities as a way of thinking about research, obviously it can't take the same objective approach that science can. Inevitably, the humanities has to take a more subjective approach, which is about the interpretations of people, but this still gets turned into knowledge in a way that can be reliable, because the humanities builds up frameworks of trust around particular ways of interpreting things. Of course, there are possibilities for certain types of measurements. For example, it is possible if you have an ancient manuscript, you can measure the date at which that might have been made through carbon dating processes. There are certain things you can do that are quasi-scientific, but ultimately the humanities creates knowledge by constant discussion and presentation of evidence from historical, analytical approaches, and through academics essentially agreeing or disagreeing with each other and eventually coming to consensus opinions. Lastly, we have the arts and performance, which inevitably tends to take a subjective point of view, but because, like practice research, and this is essentially talking about practice research now, we get into the point where rather than having academics objectively attempting to assess artworks, literature, languages, etc., it now becomes about them being assessed subjectively by the artist themselves. Sorry, I did say the humanities objectively there. There is an objective-subjective slippage here where the humanities are still individually, subjectively discussing their interpretations, but the weight of successive subjectivities becomes a kind of objective knowledge where everyone agrees that Shakespeare can be interpreted in a certain way, etc. However, when you get down to arts and performance, you are then largely dealing with what we go on to talk about in practice research, that it is the very subjective approach of the artist or performer themselves that forms the knowledge. And because this is a new area, inevitably there are certain tensions that this brings in. I've slightly cut off the last line of this, but all of these disciplines and the disciplines that make these up, so STEM is an area, And within that area of science, for example, there are many disciplines. There are the umbrella disciplines of chemistry, biology, etc. Below those, there are the subdisciplines of physical chemistry, analytical chemistry, etc. And also we have interdisciplines, biochemistry, molecular physics, etc. All of these places where disciplines bleed across into each other, transdisciplines that overarch each other, intradisciplines, etc. So very rapidly, as you start to look closely at these things, you see all sorts of contradictions and strange things that happen. There are certainly places within the science, for example, that are alarmingly close to the humanities. There are points within physics and cosmology which it essentially turns into philosophy using maths. And there are places in philosophy where there's enough maths and logic going on to essentially call it a branch of mathematics. Anyways, the point being, though, that research is always about epistemologies in this sense. Epistemology being the study of how we generate knowledge, how we decide that knowledge is reliable. And all of these different forms of research have different epistemological bases. Again, for STEM subjects, the epistemology is largely about control and measurement. In the humanities, the epistemology is largely about interpretation and argument of facts, etc. So thinking about how this can then be modelled, how we think about, as Grix puts it here, the interrelationship between the building blocks of research. Kerrigan, quoting from Grix, demonstrate this large-scale view from an ontology through an epistemology, through a methodology, through individual methods, right down to sources themselves. What's out there to know? What things are even thinkable in an ontology? What things can we conceive of as knowing? Epistemologies. What can we know about things? Methodologies. How can we acquire that knowledge? Methods. What are the actual procedures we can use to acquire the knowledge? And data. What type of data can we actually collect? If you think about this from a science perspective, the kind of data that you can collect is what is measurable. And that goes the whole way up then through this line, right back up to the basic ontology of physics is still going to be around what is actually measurable. If we can't measure it, it kind of doesn't count. Except in cosmology, where you almost can't measure anything, so they can imagine all sorts of fun things via maths. Epistemologies and methodologies and methods all come about the same way. In, for example, chemistry. What kind of data can we collect in chemistry? 200 or 300 years ago, or even 500 years ago, the best they could do was what they could see, what they could boil up. There was no way of actually looking at molecules. There was no way of looking at the bonds between things. It was very difficult to tell whether something was a mixture or a compound. So the methodologies of chemistry 500 or 1,000 years ago was closer to what we might call alchemy. But as we go on through time, what becomes possible through methods, the procedures that scientists can use to measure things, in chemistry, for example, become better techniques, more exact, more specific, so different kinds of data can be collected. But largely, the ontologies and the epistemologies don't really change. Transferring this over into artistic or practice research, the question of sources becomes much more difficult, because this is largely about the practitioner themselves working with what they are doing in order to generate data that they can then frame as research. So, for example, as a composer, when I'm writing a piece of music, what data can I collect about that? I have the finished piece of music, I have the score and maybe some recordings, but that's the end, that's not the process. What data can I collect about how it was actually done? What methods can I use? What precise procedures can I use to acquire data about how I composed that piece, how it was happening? What are my epistemologies? What and how can we know about the process that I had? I can't take my entire brain over the 6-month period it took to write that piece and just dump it down any meaningful form. So this is largely what artistic research is about. How do we apply this map that you're seeing here onto an artist creating a piece of work? So to finish this video, I leave you on that point that we have this structure for generating knowledge. Knowledge is what research is supposed to generate, as we saw earlier. The question of how does research have a process of investigation? How does it produce insights, and how are those effectively shared? All of those questions relate to this structure here. Which data can we collect? Which data can we use as a process of investigation? What precise procedures and methods can we use in order to investigate the process of making, the process of creating? How can we go about acquiring that knowledge? What and how can we know about it? All of these things then we're trying to apply to, or in order for us to say, this is research. The process of making this piece of music or film or dance or architecture, that there was research happening across that, and this research can be captured in some way, and that research, the insights from that, can then be effectively shared. We'll look at practice research in the next short video.